Am I supposed to be mic'd up in front of the television? I mean, I'm reasonably sure I can be heard within the confines of this room without it, but I don't know.
I think so. Yeah, it'll pick it up.
Okay.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Brian Thornton, and I'm a precinct chair for the local Republican Party. I, along with my fellow precinct chairman, Amanda Smith and Mallory Miller, have organized today's event to talk about something that is very important, and that is the role of religion in determining our laws and public policies. Before we get started, I'm going to turn the floor over to Mr. Mallory Miller, who will introduce our guest speakers this morning, who we are more than privileged to have with us this morning. Thank you.
Good morning. We are privileged to have with us today Professor Arnold Loewy, the Texas Tech Law faculty. Professor Loewy has been teaching law for a great many years. First on the faculty of University of North Carolina, then the faculty of University of Connecticut, and now faculty of Texas Tech University Law School.
This is my 50th year.
Yes, yes. We are about the same vintage. He is the Killam Professor of Criminal Law at Texas Tech University, the first holder of that endowed professorship. He's written a number of articles, two that I would like to mention to you that I think are extremely enticing. One of them is rejecting both Smith and RFRA. The other one is rethinking search and seizure in the post 9/11 world. In both cases, intensely important subjects because they affect our day-to-day lives. Professor Loewy is leader of conferences, speaker at many conferences, has a very active career in the teaching of law and the promulgation of law. Our other speaker is Dr. Donald May. Dr. May is a physician, an ophthalmologist, has been on the faculties of the University of Illinois, the University of Texas, University of California, Tulane University, and Texas Tech's Health Science Center. He is a farmer. He's been engaged in business. He is a writer and is interested in politics. He is active in civic matters, member of the Lubbock Board of Health, for example. A hotbed of controversy, although one would not ordinarily think that's the case. And is also a candidate for Congress in the 19th Congressional District. Ladies and gentlemen, we are privileged to have two fine gentlemen with us today who will enlighten us, you can be sure.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning.
All 12 or 13 of you. Anyway, I want to begin by talking about what our topic is not about today. It is not about one of the subjects that Dr. May and I have debated very regularly, most recently this past Thursday at the law school, namely the extent to which religion can intertwine itself with government, or perhaps more accurately, government can intertwine itself with religion. That is, we are not talking about whether it is appropriate to have school prayer, legislative prayer, town meeting prayer, 10 commandments in courthouses, 10 commandments at Texas state houses, crosses in the desert, or any of those kinds of things that have typically badly split the court and frankly badly split Dr. May and me. We're still buddies and all of that, but ideologically split.
Good friends disagree.
I am willing to assume arguendo, and I underscore the word arguendo, that on all of those questions, he's been right and I've been wrong. That the framers wanted religion to be part of government. They wanted government and religion intertwined, despite the fact that Roger Williams, our most pious founder, said otherwise, and that interweaving government and religion to a significant degree is okay. But the topic we're debating today is whether laws predicated on morality, usually religious morality, simpliciter, without more, are constitutionally permissible or aren't they? Put differently, in addition to the immorality of the behavior being regulated, must there be a utilitarian purpose therefore? And I underscore the word as utilitarian and not secular, because secular has a little bit of a loaded quality to it, and I don't want to load it in any particular way. What I am concerned about, though, is whether the fact that something is said to be immoral by a majority of the people, whether standing alone, that's enough, or whether you have to come up with some other reason for it. The proposition which I choose to argue is that you do have to come up with some other reason for it, and if you can't, the law is unconstitutional. And I would argue, and this is a point the court has not come to understand yet, I would argue that it's unconstitutional not just on due process grounds, but on Establishment Clause grounds. That is, if there's no other reason for the law except that God says you shouldn't do it, or some version of God says you shouldn't do it, or some biblical passage says you shouldn't do it, and you can't come up with any other reason for it. That's not a good enough reason, because that is imposing person A's religion on person B, which is something that a free society should never do. Now, let me read to you a couple of brief excerpts from Supreme Court opinions as to where this issue was joined. Two cases dealing with homosexual rights, and for the record, neither dealing with homosexual marriage, Bowers v. Hardwick and Lawrence v. Texas. Bowers first approached the issue of whether or not a law precluding private homosexual behavior was constitutionally permissible. The state of Georgia in that case argued that homosexuality was immoral. And the petitioner, actually was the respondent in the case, Hardwick, argued that morality is not sufficient to justify a law. And here's what the court said. The court said, "The law, however, is constantly based on notions of morality. And if all laws respecting essentially moral choices are to be invalidated under the Due Process Clause, the courts will be very busy indeed." Well, several years later, I believe it was roughly 15 years after Bowers, in Lawrence v. Texas, a somewhat differently constituted court considered the same question, and in an opinion by Justice Kennedy, which did not sit too well with Justice Scalia, I might add, said, "The fact that the governing majority in a state has traditionally viewed a particular practice as immoral is not a sufficient reason for upholding a law prohibiting that practice." The simple thesis of my talk is Kennedy was right, and the Bowers court, I believe it was Berger's opinion, was wrong. And although the Lawrence court chose to predicate its decision on the Due Process Clause, I think the correct home should have been establishment of religion. Let me go back to the first case where the court should have done that, although the point wasn't really argued in the case, and I can understand why the court didn't do it. And that was Griswold versus Connecticut. Some of you, I know there are some non-lawyers in the audience, I'm pretty sure. You may not all be familiar with the case. This was a case that dealt with a Connecticut statute in the mid-60s. Interestingly, I could add as a footnote, I lived in Connecticut in the mid-60s. That was my first teaching gig in 1964 at the University of Connecticut Law School. Connecticut had a statute making it unlawful for anyone, including married people, to use contraceptive devices. Griswold was a family planner who was trying to plan families with her clients and was concerned about being criminally prosecuted, and indeed was criminally prosecuted when she admitted to advising her married clients to use contraceptive devices. And she argued that the statute was unconstitutional. Some of you may know that this is the case that invented the amorphous right to privacy. I think that was a bad idea. I think Don and I probably agree on that point. I don't think it was found anywhere in the Constitution. I don't think it's terribly meaningful. If the right to privacy really meant what it said, it would include the right to use drugs in the privacy of one's home. It does not, or at least has not yet. And in fact, I don't think it's terribly meaningful. Indeed, it was applied as a basis of Roe v. Wade, which I'll talk about later, to invalidate abortions which are performed in public hospitals, and I don't quite know what that had to do with privacy. It was just kind of a very amorphous term, because what the court was doing was looking for an answer. Basically, what it was saying is, hey, you can't do this. We know that a majority of your population is Catholic. And we know that part of Catholic doctrine is that sex for some purpose other than procreation is immoral. And we know that that's why you've enacted this statute. And we do not think that you can impose one group, even the majority's group, morality on minorities who don't see the practice of sex within marriage for purposes other than procreation as being immoral. That's what I think the court should have said. Now, instead, as I say, they invented this right to privacy and decided the case on the ground that this violates the right to privacy because the state doesn't have a good enough reason for it. Just interestingly, the state of Connecticut was unwilling to argue morality. I think the reason it wasn't is because if it knew if it did, they'd come up with my response, namely that this isn't going to be sufficient. Rather, the state tried to come up with a utilitarian justification. What the state argued was that, you know, if it were lawful to use contraceptive devices in marriage, people would be more likely to have contraceptive devices. And if they had contraceptive devices, they'd be more likely to engage in an act of adultery, and the state has an interest in precluding adultery. Therefore, to prevent that from happening, we just won't let them use the contraceptive devices in the first place. Now, it was perfectly lawful to buy them, indeed for the prevention of disease, which presumably would be more relevant in adultery than it would be in marriage, since blood tests were required prior to marriage. So as Justice White said in his concurring opinion, the intrinsic power of this argument is not readily obvious, kind of an understatement. So that was Griswold. And that's really the way the court should have decided this case. Now, let's assume arguendo that my position isn't adopted. terrible thing, but it happens sometimes. Let's just assume that it wasn't adopted, and we have the rule that if a majority of people think some practice is immoral, then the minority who don't follow it can be punished. Let's try some hypotheticals. Let's assume that a majority of people in a particular community really believe that God and the truth therein is embodied in the Second Street Baptist Church. And let's assume that a majority of the community attend the Second Street Baptist Church, including a majority of the town's representatives. They enact legislation saying it shall be unlawful for anybody to, and I will say willfully in case a person's sick, to willfully abstain from attending the Second Street Baptist Church on Sunday morning between 10 and 12. And let's assume that Mary decides she wants to go to the First Street Baptist Church and does. Well, she gets a $500 fine for the first offense, 30 days in jail for the second offense. Hey, it's morality. We follow morality. That's the morality of this community. You go to the Second Street Baptist Church, you don't go to the First Street Baptist Church. Well, that's probably a fairly easy one because you'd say that does interfere with free exercise and there's a specific prohibition against it, so no real problem. Well, let's try some others. It shall be unlawful in this community for any male to trim his beard. Right from Leviticus. It's right there. Right along with forbidding homosexuality and eating pork and all the rest of it. It's right there. So let's assume that at some point when my beard grows in a little bit more, I decide to trim it. Can they haul me off to jail for that? Well, why not? If morality is a good enough reason for the law, and morality is something that the people think is there, and it's from the Bible, well, why couldn't they punish? Well, why can't you trim your beard? The Red Sox players don't. I'm a Red Sox fan. I can't resist mentioning that. But they could. There's no law against them doing it. How about eating pork? Suppose either an Orthodox Jewish or a Muslim group control the particular community and assume that local legislation permits them to do that. It shall be unlawful to eat pork in this community. Joe, who owns the 3rd Street Diner, serves ham and eggs to Sam, who comes on in to eat it. Or Nancy goes down to her local supermarket and buys 3 pounds of pork chops. In the supermarket, the diner owner, the diner, and the purchaser from the supermarket, can they all be prosecuted? I would think not. I asked the question, is there a utilitarian reason for the law? Could a skeptic, could a religious skeptic, could somebody who doesn't necessarily buy literal Leviticus find a good reason for doing it? The only one I could think of was you might have some opposition from an animal, or some support from an animal rights activist who would like to save the poor pigs and thinks that people shouldn't eat anything. He really wants to save the lambs and the cows too. But hey, you'll take what you can get, and if you can get the pork, I'll support this legislation. But that's so small and so rare. It's not really substantial. And in terms of could there be any substantial reason for the law? Not really. And now let's take some of the other things in here. No homosexuality. It's right there with beard cutting and pork eating in Leviticus. It says it right there. A man shall not lay down with man. I think it says nor woman with woman. I'm not sure about that. But in any event, assume that you take the majority of the legislature, as Texas did, pass the law, said, well, it's immoral. It's right there in Leviticus. It says it. It's immoral. You can't do it. Well, if I'm right on the beard trimming and I'm right on the pork eating, I think I'm right, and I think the court was right in Lawrence v. Texas and wrong in Bowers v. Hardwick, that that's not a good enough justification for it. You have to be able to come up with some utilitarian reason. You might argue that homosexual behavior is a more efficient transmitter of AIDS. That's not the argument that was made, and I might add it's not a terribly powerful one either, because although anal sex is a somewhat more efficient transmitter of AIDS and other venereal diseases, oral sex is a less efficient transmitter than classic penile-vaginal sex. So you really couldn't defend the full scope of the Texas law on that ground. And I think after that, you've run out of utilitarian reasons. Do we want to say we want to force everybody to have kids? Maybe Connecticut could have tried that in Griswold. But do we think Texas really needs population? Well, if we could guarantee they live somewhere between San Antonio and El Paso on that strip that really needs populating, maybe. But I hardly think that Houston, Dallas, or Fort Worth, or even Lubbock need more people than we currently have, and I don't think that's the rationale for either the Connecticut law or the Texas law. So it seems to me pretty clear that those laws are unconstitutional. Fornication, I think almost certainly, it certainly does fall within Lawrence v. Texas. I mean, surely if we're going to say that John can't be punished for having sex in the privacy of his home with Tyrone, if he picked Tanya rather than Tyrone, I can't imagine a different result. So I think that's pretty clearly covered as well. Adultery, I think, is one which probably could be punished, or at least it couldn't be saved under my rationale. The reason it couldn't is because unlike the other crimes, you have victims. And there may be a terribly religiously skeptical wife who doesn't like it when she finds out her husband was out having sex with somebody else. It's a violation of the marriage contract, which would exist whether or not we had religion. And, well, I'm not necessarily endorsing criminal laws against adultery. I actually don't think they're a very good idea. I don't think they fall for the rationale that I'm giving you. Bigamy or polygamy, I mean, obviously if it involves child abuse, that's an easy question, the one that we hear about the most. If it doesn't, I think it's very similar to the adultery question. If Joe is married to Mary and he doesn't tell anybody else about, he doesn't tell Susan about this when he marries her. He doesn't tell either Susan about Mary or Mary about Susan, just kind of bides his time between the two. He has injured both of them. Now, if it's consensual, that is, if Joe and Mary decide, Mary says, Joe, you're just too much for me. You need another wife. And said, I think my friend Susan might be interested. So they talk to Susan, and Susan's interested. And they say, yeah, let's do it. I actually do think there's a good utilitarian reason for not recognizing the second marriage legally. Because if one person could get 6 wives and other people were limited to 1, various governmental benefits would be skewed disproportionately there. So I think but on the other hand, it's very clear under Griswold and its progeny that Joe, Mary, and Susan could live together. And if they want to solemnize the relationship in their religion, I don't see anything wrong with their having a religious marriage under those circumstances, nor do I see any legitimate interest in the state trying to prevent it. I think it might be helpful to look at some of the 10 Commandments, which some people claim are the foundation of Anglo-American law. I don't think that's correct. I think if you look at the 10 Commandments, sacred as they are. 3 of them, thou shalt not kill, or being Jewish, I'd say thou shalt not murder. Actually, Don, you might like thou shalt not murder better because it allows the death penalty. In any event, thou shalt not kill or murder, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Translated in modern terms, thou shalt not commit perjury. I think laws precluding those things are fine. Of course, it's interesting that rape, arson, burglary, and a few other things aren't covered in there, which are pretty important also. But some of the other things, thou shalt not covet. Do you imagine a law against coveting? We have one, we're at a party, Mary says, boy, I sure like my cousin Elizabeth's Mercedes. I sure wish I could have it. Aha, I heard you, you're coveting. You, Mary, are under arrest for coveting. I mean, heck, although, part of my minority status is I'm not even a Republican, but Brian knew that when he invited me. But as far as Republican ethos goes, I know rewarding incentive is thought to be a good thing. And encouraging incentive is thought to be a good thing for private enterprise. If you can't covet, I mean, hey, if she doesn't care about the Mercedes, why should she work for one? It would probably be a bad thing if everybody were completely satisfied with things the way they were and they didn't covet making things a little bit better. So I can't imagine that you could make that a law. Or profaning the Sabbath. When I'm finished here, I'm going to go home and watch my beloved Red Raiders play on television today, profaning the Jewish Sabbath. Should they be subject to punishment for that? Tomorrow I'll be watching my beloved Patriots and also Red Sox play baseball on the Christian Sabbath. Should they be hauled off and arrested for profaning the Sabbath? I don't think so. You're kind of laughing at it, and it's understandable. Now, there are plenty of things that seem to be based on morality that have utilitarian bases to them. Cruelty to animals, for one. It's immoral to brutally attack a puppy dog. The Noahide laws, the kind of the predecessor to the 10 Commandments at the time of Noah, had one provision saying it's one of the 7 Noahide laws was that you can't remove the limb of a live animal. Kind of a specialized cruelty to animal. I never understood why that one quite made it, given some of the stuff that wasn't covered there. But in any event, again, you can be a total religious skeptic and still care a great deal about animals. And on that score, I said I'd mention abortion, and I think I will. Roe v. Wade is not one that can be resolved on the basis of to be sure, there are religious people who, largely motivated by religious reasons, are opposed to abortion. There's no question about that. But there are also religious skeptics who believe that an organism with a full set of human genes, whether you call it a human being or an organism with a full set of human genes, is entitled to value, is entitled to be protected, and at least more frequently than the court would allow in Roe v. Wade, ought to prevail over the interest of the mother. That's not, that however you resolve the question, and just for the record, my own resolution of it would be, as a policy matter, I'm in favor of free abortion. As a constitutional matter, I do not think the Constitution incorporates my policy preference, and consequently, I think Roe v. Wade was wrongly decided. But however you resolve it, it could not be resolved on the theory that morals legislation simpliciter is unconstitutional, which I think it is. Let me conclude by talking about why I think one of the reasons why I think this is important, and I actually know this because I have a son-in-law who is an ultra-Orthodox Jew, and I assure you they are every bit as religiously conservative as the most conservative Christian you can imagine. And I can never get beyond the biblical command with them. If we were arguing, for example, the wisdom of punishing homosexual behavior, he never gets beyond the Bible. It doesn't matter what other evidence I can present to indicate to him that this law is not a good idea. It matters not. It's in the Bible, so that's it. Period. The end. And you cannot get beyond that. It's one thing to say the Bible is, as it ought to be, relevant. It is a source of something to think about, to something to consider. But it should be able to be countermanded by Shakespeare, Plutarch, whomever, John Locke, whoever your favorite philosopher may be. And it shouldn't just be something that stands out there. Well, this is what God said, the end. And if you allow moral legislation to stand, if you permit the moral legislation to exist, if you permit it to be there, that's what we're going to have. Think about it. If all the state has to say, as it did in Bowers v. Hardwick, a majority of the people think it's immoral, game over. You can't say that a majority of the people don't say it's immoral. And what does that mean? It effectively means that people in Religion A, the majority religion, Catholics in Connecticut, can shove their laws down the throats of other people. Now, granted, candidly, when I lived in Connecticut, I actually knew of people who were violating that law. But be that as it may, some laws are easier to violate than others. If you had the don't eat pork law, or the don't drive on the Sabbath law, or something like that, that could be enforced. It would be based on morality, and the majority of the population would be able to shove their religious views down the throat of the minority. And to the extent that that can happen, to the extent that that's what we're doing, we will cease to be the free people that our founding fathers intended for us to be.
Thank you, Professor Loewy. We'll get Dr. May set up for his PowerPoint presentation here.
While they're setting up, let me bring a couple things to your attention. What Professor Loewy, one of the prime things that you were using was your paper, Moral Legislation and the Establishment Clause. And if you go on the internet, most of the places you have to pay to download this. But if you go to the Social Science Research Network, you can take a look at this and copy it down. It's about 28 pages, and I would highly recommend downloading this. And while we're setting up here, maybe we can douse the lights a little bit too. I realize this is a debate. I'm going to make a few comments on what Professor Loewy said. Professor Loewy and I are probably far more in agreement than even Professor Loewy realizes, because I agree with just about everything you said. I think we approach things in a little bit different way. But we're more, rather than converging, Professor Loewy, you and I are more on parallel tracks, I think. Because you have the appreciation of coming from a Jewish background. I have appreciation for coming from a Jewish Christian background. I mean, we Christians are Jewish sect, right? So, I mean, that's basically what we are, and we differentiate ourselves. But I just want to, before I start, I'm just make a couple comments. I look at law pretty much all law directs morality. And one of the great things that we have before us right now is the personal mandate, where the government's trying to force morality on us, that morality being having health insurance coverage. And it went through the court, it was decided to be a tax. Well, they said it's a tax. Well, that's moral. Well, we don't necessarily agree, but again, they're trying to impose morality. The pork eating and the shellfish and cooking the kid in the mother's milk and that had health implications, because pork, people ate things back then. A lot of times they didn't cook it. Get ill and die from that. Get ill and die from shellfish. I mean, people were pooping in the water and then going out and getting the clams and oysters. Still happens. So we have problems there. Adultery. One of the problems there is, again, breaking down the family unit. Interesting case in point, you all know who Charles Lindbergh was. Well, when he was on his deathbed, he confessed to his wife that in addition to the family he had fathered with her, he had fathered 3 other families, intact families. So he had 4 separate families that he had raised as totem. And then again, the covet, you have a group that directs the government to confiscate money and property, and this comes right down to modern times, where we have a group of people who says to Obama, or Obama says to them, hey, elect me, I'll go take the money from those guys over there and give it to you. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to go through, again, I think this is more parallel than confrontational to what Professor Loewy is presenting, and that's one of the great joys I've had in debating with Professor Loewy, is we have the same goals and the same perspective, is that we come at it in a little different way. So when I'm up in Washington, Professor Loewy is going to continue to be one of my trusted advisors, because the great thing about this country is we need competition. We need competition in ideas. We need competition in all aspects. And one of the problems with religion is people get so uptight and serious about religious ideology that they don't listen to what other folks are saying. And they don't, and I'm going to take, is it okay if I take my jacket off? I won't gross anybody out, will I? You won't tell Matt Powell I took my jacket. Okay, good. Good. Okay, I'm going to, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I missed it. Here.
You're not doing anything. You're good.
Okay, and we ask ourselves, I'm going to go through some things because I want to raise questions in people's minds. That's the whole purpose, Professor Loewy and I debating, raising questions in people's minds, getting people to think. Because there's many things that we don't have a solution to. We don't have relevance to. We look at the Old Testament, we look at the New Testament, we look at other religions, we look at John Locke, we look at Bacon, we look at Newton, we look at the teachings of Jesus Christ, and it doesn't cover all the things that we're dealing with today. Okay, does it make sense? We ask ourselves, why are some things okay in society, and why are some things not okay? Why are some things permitted? If we have separation of church and state, why are schools and libraries building Muslim footbaths and students aren't allowed to gather, have Christian gatherings on campus or prayer at football games, and now military people aren't allowed to necessarily pray or use the term Jesus or Christ? We look at the imposition of laws. I look at our country as based on Judeo-Christian principles. Basically, Professor Loewy and I have the same principles. They were laid down, the 10 Commandments. We talked about other laws, touched on that, eating pork and so forth. Those aren't part of the 10 Commandments. And then we have, in Christian law, Christ took the 10 Commandments and summarized them in the Golden Rule. If we take the 10 Commandments and put it all together, and it's do unto others as you would have them do unto you, pretty much solidifies and puts together that whole thought. Because if you think, If you've got a friend over here who's shall we say, agnostic or an atheist or some other religion, how would they want to be treated, or how would you want to be treated? And that summarizes our 10 Commandments. Now we look at the two major religions in the world now that want to impose their values and put it into law. We have Sharia law, which is Muslim, and we have secular law, which is the absence of God. These are the two major religions now that are trying to create laws. One of them we just talked about here was the imposition of morality, saying it is immoral to not have health insurance. Therefore, everybody has to buy health insurance, and if you don't, we are going to punish you with a fine. Okay? So, only valid law, both of them think that they're the only valid law. Sex, significant restrictions under Sharia law. Guy can have 4 wives, he can have unlimited prostitutes and friends, as long as he marries them before he has sex with them and then divorces them immediately afterwards. Secular law, subsidized. Unlimited sex, safe sex. Obama said, you like me, and everybody can have birth control, as opposed to what Professor Loewy was talking about in that state. Everybody can have birth control and everybody can have unlimited abortions. Go for it. So, only valid law. Diet. Significant restrictions under Sharia law. You don't want any pigs running around. You live in a Muslim country, you don't get to have a ham sandwich. Under secular law, very restricted. Thou shalt not eat what is on the back table. Okay? If it tastes good, spit it out. If it has sugar in it or fat in it, you can't have it. If it has salt in it, that's a no-no. Doesn't matter that low-salt diets are the leading cause of type 2 diabetes in the world. Doesn't matter that kids drop over dead every day because they're hyponatremic when they're exercising and they drink a couple bottles of water when they're running a marathon. Leading cause of death in marathons is low-salt diets. People don't have enough salt on board. They go out there, they sweat it off, they drink a couple liters of water without any salt basis in it. They go hyponatremic, they drop over dead. Okay? Hygiene. Very specific hygiene laws. Secular law, thou shalt not use too much toilet paper. Okay? Thou shalt not use too much water in the shower. I get in the shower at a hotel, it's going 2.5 gallons per minute. I'm a big guy. It takes me 20 minutes to get all that soap off, okay? I go in a real shower, I'm in and out in 2 minutes, okay? Prayer. 5 times a day, very specific under secular law, restricted. Thou shalt not pray in public, thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that. Fasting, very specific rules here. Again, not entirely different from Judaic law or some Christian laws. Many of my Christian friends will fast. But under secular law, remember what Obama said, you're not going to get as much to eat anymore with me being president. Now, I'm going to get plenty to eat, but you guys aren't. So just some things, again, to think about. Protecting us from good intentions. Both religions, the secularists and the Muslims, just like the Jews, the Christians, they all have good intentions. But our Constitution was put together to protect us from those good intentions. As Daniel Webster said, it's hardly too strong to say that the Constitution was made to guard the people against the dangers of good intentions. Because most of the people who support Barack Obama, they have good intentions, right? They may have good intentions. Origins of our law. William Blackstone, Commentaries on the Laws of England. And what did he say about the law? And what I'm saying here is not that we should have Judeo-Christian laws per se, but I'm saying that Judeo-Christian laws are the foundation of our government and the foundations of Western civilization laws. And Professor Loewy and I think disagree a little bit here, but I think fundamentally we're on parallel paths. But he says, man considered a creature must necessarily be subject to the laws of his creator, for he's an entirely dependent being. He should at all points conform to his maker's will. This is called the law of nature. Declaration of Independence, nature's God. There are no human laws of any validity if contrary to this. So Blackstone is saying any human laws that are contrary to the foundations of Christianity, that is, the Ten Commandments, the Golden Rule, are not valid. Okay? When you think about laws and whether that really applies or not. And then we had coming along that that was the foundational book until we got James Kent, who was Chief Justice of the New York Supreme Court and authored commentaries on American law. So this came several decades down the line. But Kent said, whatsoever strikes at the root of Christianity tends to manifest the disillusion of civil government. And we're talking here about civil government. And he's saying if you strike at the root of Christianity, the underlying foundation, you're going to break down your civil government. And what I'm going to be telling you here is pretty much the same from all of these people. Joseph Story, Chief Justice, United States Supreme Court, was appointed to the Supreme Court, I believe 31 or 32, youngest justice ever appointed, wrote the commentaries on the Constitution of the United States. And he said, yet it remains a problem to be solved in human affairs whether any free government can be permanent, where the public worship of God and the support of religion constitute no part of the policy or duty of the state in any assigned shape. So Story is saying if you get rid of religion from government, that government is going to fail. And I would contend that is exactly what we have been seeing in our country over the past many decades. Founding fathers established the United States and its Constitution on a solid foundation of religious principles with very limited federal powers. John Quincy Adams. This is an 1837 photograph of John Quincy Adams, oldest known photograph of any American president. Most people don't even realize that people were taking pictures back in 1837, but that's not a bad quality photograph for almost 120 years, or 180 years old. He said the Declaration of Independence laid the cornerstone of human government upon the first precepts of Christianity. There he's meaning basically the golden rule of Christ. Nation's founding document, Declaration of Independence, we just touched bases on that. First 126 words are called the preface. And go home, take a look at that. And in these first 126 words, we're told, number one, there's a creator. Number two, our creator gives us unalienable rights. Number three, God has an unchangeable moral law that governs men. That would be the Ten Commandments. And our government is established to protect the laws God has given us. Basically, our founding document says that the sole reason of our federal government is to protect the rights that we have received from God. There is no other purpose than doing that. And then number five, we the people will be governed only with our consent. If we don't like it, doesn't happen. Differing views. This is the first person who is trying to get rid of our Constitution and our foundations. He said, if you want to understand the real Declaration of Independence, don't read the preface. That was Woodrow Wilson. Now, a lot of you haven't seen this before, right? They don't teach this in school. Lincoln said, let me entreat you to come back to the truths that are in the Declaration of Independence. Not specifically talking about the preface, but assuredly referring to it. Religious freedom, First Amendment, Constitution, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. My belief is religion such as the Church of England, and that's not our purpose to be discussing that, or prohibiting the free practice thereof. This is a restriction imposed on the federal government. The federal government is mandated not to interfere. So the federal government should not be telling our troops that they can't pray. Okay? And to prevent interference in religious practice. Religious beliefs and institutions. Religious freedom is the first freedom. Second freedom is, Second Amendment was put there to protect the First Amendment, right? As Obama referring to Bibles and guns. People cling to both of them, First and Second Amendment, right? Right, prosecutor? Right. Okay, good. Got a smile out of her. Good. Assaults on religious liberty are assaults on all constitutional liberties, and basically the First Amendment to protect freedom of conscience, Establishment Clause, Free Exercise Clause. and this is deviating a little bit from what we're saying, and what did our founding fathers say about the role of religion in our government, hence the role of religion in our laws. Washington, true religion affords government its greatest support. John Adams, religion and virtue are the only foundations of republicanism in all free governments. And Noah Webster, the moral principles and precepts contained in the scriptures ought to form the basis of our civil constitutions and laws. Okay? And of consequence, each of the 50 states in its preamble specifically mentions God. The U.S. Constitution only mentions God in its last paragraph, year of our Lord, okay? But constitutions of all our states, this is Texas, humbly invoking the blessing of Almighty God, the people of the state of Texas do ordain and establish this Constitution. And if you look at the preamble to every one of the other 49 states, it's quite similar. John Adams. This is a letter to the Massachusetts militia. We have no government armed with the power capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality or religion. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So he's saying, you take religion out, you take the foundations of religion out, our government isn't going to work. They started trying to get God out of the religions shortly, well, from the very beginning. Big push after Darwin came on the scenes in the 1820s because people said, aha, this guy's proved that there's no God. You know, it all happened by accident. So this went to the House and the Senate. This is just the House of Representatives. And their conclusion was any attempt to level and discard all religion would have been viewed with universal indignation. This is the Founding Fathers. Religion must be considered as a foundation on which the whole structure rests. Calvin Coolidge, our government rests upon religion. It is from that source that we derive our reverence for truth and justice, for equality and liberty, and for the rights of mankind. Unless the people believe in these principles, they cannot believe in our government. Again, foundation for the government and foundation for the laws. Not taking the laws specifically from religion, but using it as an undergirding principle. Differing views again on the Constitution. Here's that guy Woodrow Wilson again. American Constitution is little more than political witchcraft from the past. It ought to be discarded so we can get on with the progressive project of building a national state. And then Reagan, our Constitution is a document that protects the people from the government. Plain and simple, best statement of the purpose of our Constitution. Federalist, number 78. If you haven't read the Federalist Papers, you need to read them. You know, particularly those of you who are in law school, going to law school, wanting to go to law school. This is really the foundation of understanding. And the Heritage Foundation has a great little book of about less than 100 pages. It says Guide to Understanding the Federalist Papers. I think it's free. So I would highly recommend that. Constitution directs judges to say what the law is rather than what they want to be. Okay? Plain and simple. Courts of justice, whose duty it is to declare all acts contrary to the manifest tenor of the Constitution are void. That is, if it's against the plan of the Constitution, it is void. Anti-religious bias continues to dominate ever since Everson in 1947. The Supreme Court has been rewriting the First Amendment, relying not on the Constitution, but its own precedent law. And as Thomas Jefferson warned, he said the Constitution is a mere thing of wax in the hands of the judiciary, which they may twist and shape into any form they please. Well, we have been seeing that. Now, how did all this relativism and kicking out of natural law get started? Well, along came this guy, Charles Darwin. And from that, they created Darwinian theory, which says everything was created by accident, man evolved. Well, Charles Darwin didn't say any of that. All he said was God created this, and that within individual species, we've got variation. He was down there in the Pacific going to these islands, and little Tweety birds, these songbirds, in one island they looked one color, another island they looked another color, okay? We look around at dogs. There's probably 500 species of dogs running around Lubbock County alone. And then if you go out to the farm, you go out to the fair, you see 40, 50 species of chickens. You look around this room. You can't mistake any one of us in this room for somebody else. And as you go through life, you will once in a while, you might encounter somebody who looks like somebody else, but you can still tell the difference. I go out to my herd of cows when we used to raise cattle. The city slicker would come out there and he'd look at the cows and he'd say, oh, they all look the same. I go to my chicken house, the chickens all look the same. No, every one of those chickens in that chicken house, I can tell the difference. Normal genetic variation. So along came Christopher Columbus Langdale, similar beard, and he said laws must also evolve. This is where the concept of the living constitution comes in. Judges must direct the evolution of our constitution laws and then we have case law. So, as Professor Loewy, I agree, in law school, they study case law. They don't go back and necessarily study the original intent of the Constitution. And which leads to what we call legal positivism or relativism applied to law. And since man and society evolve, law must evolve, judges through their decision guide the evolution of the law. The original source of the law are the decisions of the government. So no longer the Constitution or the intent of the writers of the framers of the Constitution, but the subsequent case law becomes the final decision arbiter. And again, there are no objective God-given standards of law, or if there are, they are irrelevant in the modern legal system. That is the quote from legal positivism. And since God is not the author of law, the author must be man, and the state is the highest human authority. So we go from authority of foundational religious law to the authority of man. No longer in God we trust, but in man we trust. Real dangers of legal positivism are laws are made by unelected justices. These are appointed people. Constitution is changed without amending it. If you look at Article 5, there's two ways to amend it, either through Congress or through the states. And the justices' values often do not reflect the will of we the people, such as we see with the Affordable Care Act. Somewhere in a majority of people are against the Affordable Care Act. Depending on how you phrase the polls, it's anywhere between about 51% and about 80%. And Washington said, let there be no change by usurpation, the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. How are we doing time-wise? 5 minutes? Is that okay? We okay, time-wise? Okay. And let's just take a look at, again, other foundations that we have here. We're digressing a little bit, but I want to show the foundational characteristic of our government. Congress added under God to our Pledge of Allegiance. This was during the Cold War. Comments coming out of Congress were to distinguish us from the godless communists. In the House Committee on the Judiciary, 1954, the report that they printed, adding these words affirmed, quote, the dependence of our people and our government upon the moral directions of the Creator. Again, foundational to our government. Not saying that our laws come specifically from there, but they're foundational. Original selection for the Great Seal, Benjamin Franklin, who is vilified as being non-religious. He was on the committee for the Great Seal. This is the obverse side of the Great Seal. This is what Benjamin Franklin drew. Rebellion of the tyrants is obedience to God. And Benjamin Franklin thought on the back of the Great Seal should be Moses with the pillar of fire drowning Pharaoh. That's what he thought should be on the back of our Great Seal, showing that we took on King George III and his troops and put them down. Now what do we have on there? We've got, this is the obverse side, and this is Greek from, both are Greek from Virgil, top and bottom. This is the Aeneid, this is the seventh Decorum, but basically it says, God approves of what has been started, and what has been started is a new order of the ages, that is, a country where the people are in control and not a small elite. And that's what we're trying to come back to now, is taking the people out of control and putting a small elite on. And then on the front side of the Great Seal of the United States, right above the eagle, is the Star of David, okay? So we don't have a cross on there, but we do have a Star of David, which is foundational. Okay? A lot of people don't know that, okay? In God we trust on our coins. If we take that off, we're going to put on in man we trust. I mean, that's the only other alternative. From many one, right? From many one, yes. Well, that's a good one too. And then on the top of our Washington Monument facing east to the Capitol building, Laus Deo, praise be to God. Praise be to God for what has been created here. And if you go to the Smithsonian, they don't mention that. Again, our foundational songs, Star Spangled Banner, Heaven Rescued Land, praise the power that has made us and preserved us, and our motto, in God is our trust. So that's the last stanza of the Star Spangled Banner. Alexis de Tocqueville, you're familiar with him, young Frenchman who came over here because he couldn't figure out, both countries had a revolution. France wasn't doing so well and America was doing great. So he figured out that France had become atheistic and that America was still Christian. And he said the Americans combine the notions of Christianity and liberty so intimately in their minds that it's impossible to make them conceive of one without the other. And then we have this great man who was out at the Hoover Institute. He said some future Congress can make a major contribution to this country by spending its time repealing legislation and impeaching federal judges who legislate from the bench, and that's what I plan to be doing for the next 10 or so years. So thank you much. That ends my presentation, and we'll go from there.
Could I ask you a question?
Can we hold questions for the question and
How
answer
long
period?
is more time?
Yes, just there's a brief rebuttal period and then we'll take questions.
I'm looking forward to your questions.
Okay, me too.
I'd begin by saying, as I began my talk, that if you believe everything and buy into completely everything that Dr. May said, you would still can and should accept my proposal that legislation without a utilitarian purpose is inappropriate. And on that score, whether you like it or not, or think it's well executed or not, Obamacare does have a utilitarian purpose. And whatever else might be said about it, it's not unconstitutional because it's morals legislation. In regard to some of the specific things that you said, Don, first of all, I think laws must evolve. And I think Justice Brennan explained it probably as well as anybody in his concurring opinion in Abington School District v. Shemp, the school prayer case, that basically he talked about how we are a very different nation religiously than we were when we started. We may have had Chaim Solomon, but for the most part, we also had people like Story saying we can't exalt Judaism, Mohammedanism, and there was one other he put in there, I don't think it was infidels, I think, and prostrate Christianity. But we now have many more religious and irreligious people today. We also have public schools, which we didn't have back when the Constitution was framed. So for asking the question, are prayers in public school appropriate? What would the framers have thought? We have to ask the question of what would the framers have thought about a problem they didn't think about if they had thought about it? And try handling that one metaphysically. It does require a certain amount of judicial creativity, if you will, but still aiming to be consistent with the overall primary general thesis of what our framers have in mind. I absolutely agree with Don that, and with President Reagan, that the purpose of the Constitution is to protect people from government, which is exactly why we need to protect them from government-endorsed, approved, or authorized prayers. In regard to the first pictures you put up, I don't think they're accurate. The football player is entirely free to pray. He's not representing the government. There's no rule against his personal dedication to God, or when Big Papi puts his hands in the air after he hits a home run. I think that's fine. All of these things are totally appropriate. What isn't appropriate is the government endorsing religion. Now, I think there's different kinds of secularity. I think France's version of a secular society, no, you cannot wear a Muslim headdress to school. Querion yarmulkes, Querion Mormon, I guess Mormon underwear would be okay because you don't notice that. But you can't do anything that looks religious in public. That's France. That's not the United States. The United States does allow free exercise of religion. The United States does allow people to pray. It's just that the United States citizens believe that they have enough faith in God that they can determine for themselves what belongs to God, and that it needn't be collected or determined by Caesar. And I completely concur with that. I think where I disagree with some of the people who have suggested that that this government is inappropriate for irreligious people. I really think that's wrong. I think there may be some people who've said it. I could quote people who've said other things too. But I think that an atheist is every bit as much of a citizen as anybody else. I'd wonder what you'd want to do with them. You want to throw them in dungeons until they become religious? You used to do things like that. Maybe feed them to the lions. I mean, there's all sorts of things maybe you could do with them. But I think they're part of who we are. And I think there's a danger of being too specific. If we call ourselves a Christian nation, we would make me less of a citizen. I don't believe Don wants to do that. We move up to Judeo-Christian nation. Oh, good, then I'm an insider. But you Muslims, you're outsiders. I don't think that's any better. Well, do we say theistic people? Then are atheistic people not part of this country? Because I think the answer is yes, they are. I think what we should have done with the Pledge of Allegiance, if we had to modify it, I kind of liked it the way I said it in school. One nation, indivisible. I know I date myself, but that's the way I said it until when I was 14. They changed it and put in under God. But what we should have done is said with freedom of religion for all. That would have distinguished us from the Soviet Union correctly, rather than taking a position which endorses a view of some of us, but does not endorse the view of all of us. I guess since you wanted me to limit it to 5 minutes, maybe I'll stop.
That's about 5 minutes, right?
Okay.
No, go ahead, Arnold. Go ahead. You've got some-
All right.
I think it's okay. Yeah, just keep going.
Okay, let me,
So I only have a couple of minutes of comments to make, and then we can open it to questions. So, questions are all.
I did want to this really isn't part of the debate, I guess, but it might be of interest to note since you brought up Darwin. He is buried in I think I could say, the leading church of England, Westminster Abbey. I don't know how many of you knew that, but, and I also don't believe that Darwin was irreligious. That some of his disciples are, particularly Richard Dawkins, but Darwin himself tied evolution into religion. He just sort of rethought the nature of the creation. It maybe wasn't done in 7 days unless you give an awful lot of latitude to what constitutes a day. But he did see certain things. You know, I suppose I could mention on the religiosity point, my daughter tells me that her husband, my ultra-Orthodox son-in-law, gave her a hard time about taking the kids to the Smithsonian Institute because they had the temerity to suggest that the earth revolves around the sun, when of course everybody knows the sun revolves around the earth, and even worse, suggesting that maybe the earth is more than 5,774 years old. But in any event, Darwin really did retain his religiosity. I think I've hit the main point. I'm sure there's other things you said that I didn't catch in my notes that are probably deserve rebuttal, but I'm willing to let it go at that, because we do have people who want to ask us questions, and maybe you could come to the front of the room with me, and we can be here to answer their questions.
Absolutely. I'm just gonna...
By the way, Brian, I'm not sure if I thanked you yet for this invitation, but thank you very much for inviting me.
And I will second that. Thank you for putting this together. This is a great event. It's good to have lots of folks here, and really appreciate everybody here. And just another great opportunity for you and I to interact, which is, this debate has been one of the great events of my life. The last 6 months has just been a real fulfillment of a lot of things, and this has just been one of the most enjoyable things that I have done. Professor Loewy, you and I are in agreement on Darwin. He was a religious man. In his book, The Voyage of the Beagle, and his other books, Evolution of the Species, he attributes life to, creation to God. All he was really speaking about were the variation of the species from what we can come up with. But people said, aha, he's saying this all happened somehow by accident. Now that was back with the time, and inspired the book Frankenstein, where people thought you could go out to a graveyard, dig up a bunch of dead bodies, sew them together, and jolt them with electricity, and they'd come back to life. They had no idea of the complexity of life. They thought that the worms that they saw in horse troughs originated from horsehairs falling into the water. They thought that you could change base metals into gold, and even when I was in grammar school, which was back in ancient history, I guess, we used to have to trudge through snowdrifts to get to school, but they taught us that the cell was just an amorphous mass of protoplasm with a little dark spot in the middle. Now this was after Watson and Crick came up with the DNA, and that was still being taught 10, 20 years later. But again, there was no real understanding and no explanation of how, the cell minimum size of a cell is 1 trillion atoms. How 1 trillion atoms can spontaneously come together and form something that's alive and is going to replicate itself, nobody understood.
Well, even Dawkins doesn't claim it was by accident. He calls it survival of the fittest.
Well, something like, but that's the process that comes in, and I agree with survival of the fittest. It just doesn't seem to be the cause, and I think you and I are in agreement that Darwin was religious, and yes, we visited his, if I remember correctly, he's in the wall, has a prominent place in the Westminster Abbey.
Yeah, he does.
Very prominent, as I think is appropriate. I think he was a good scientific mind, and people have basically taken what he said and corrupted it. One of the things that's unique, and I think we are parallel here, Professor Loewy, is that we welcome all religious people. As a Christian nation, our founding fathers said, we're not going to be having a country here where people kill each other over religion. As you and I talked on Thursday, if somebody didn't like something, they chopped their head off, or worse yet, they shaved their head and put them on the stake and burned them alive.
But if you say among Christians, I do get to be an outsider.
Yeah, you're a Christian.
And I consider myself an equal citizen.
Well, I consider yourself too, because I may be a Christian, but Christianity is again, it's a Jewish sect. I mean, right? Christ wasn't a Christian, he was a Jew.
That's very true.
Right.
And we got the 10 Commandments.
You got it. You got the whole foundation. And Christ looked at it and said, if you just treat everybody like you want to be treated yourself, that pretty much embodies the whole 10 Commandments. So we're in full agreement, and I think that's totally embraced. As far as prayer goes, I've operated in India many times. Every day before we start surgery, the Hindu priests come out and have about a half-hour ceremony and pray, and they tell me, we hope we don't offend you. And I say, you don't offend me at all. This is your country and your religion, and you approach God in a different way than I do. one of the most interesting religions.
I like it when my doctors pray, because I think there's a utilitarian value that they'd be likely to do a better job if they think they're being divinely guided, whether they are or not.
Absolutely, and I assure you that as a surgeon in the operating room, just like a soldier in the foxhole, there is divine intervention in the operating room, because there's been many a time where things have been impossible and some power beyond me and my poor abilities to put together an eye that's gone through a windshield or encountered a beer bottle at 2 a.m. At Rose's Cafe can be put together successfully. Japan, not all the time, but often Buddhist prayers. China, a couple of times Buddhist prayers before we did surgery. Middle East, Muslim prayers. Okay, and again, this is their society, this is their culture. France is an interesting country, restricting things and headdresses and the female. And we've always welcomed atheists here, and we've always welcomed Muslims here, and we are an open society, but we don't necessarily want people to come in and say, hey, here we are, a bunch of atheists, we're going to turn change the foundations of your country. You're welcome to come here and not believe. We're not going to put you in jail for not believing, but you have the benefit of a society that's based on Judeo-Christian principles, which means we're going to treat you.
But under my theory of the Constitution, if the majority of the people ever get to be atheists, then we're probably moving, at least in a slow way, in that direction. If a majority of the citizens get to be atheists, we could never have a pledge that says one nation without God. However, even if a majority of the Supreme Court justices were atheists, I don't think they could permit that under the Establishment of Religion clause. But that same clause ought to keep the under God out as well as the without God.
Then you'd have to put in under the mind of man.
No, you don't have to put anything in. It was a perfectly fine pledge when I was in elementary school. It really was. It was fine. One nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I always, apart from the fact that I didn't really understand it perfectly, I never understood why the country was invisible and you couldn't see it. But apart from that, it was a fine pledge.
Okay. Good.
Let's take questions.
That's all
Open up for questions now?
This gentleman, I think, was first.
I want to make comments. In Dr. May's presentation,
it seems to me that you feel that if you quote enough examples of what people said 100 or 200 years ago, you might establish the validity of what they are saying today. You don't allow for the evolution of what has happened to this country. You keep quoting examples of the originators of the Constitution as basis for establishing a religion, or the importance of religion in our daily life and our political life, but you don't allow for the changes that have taken place. That's one of the comments I want to make. Another one is this.
Let's do one at a time.
Go ahead.
Let's do one at a time. Can we is there a way to shut the projector off? Can we do that?
It's another thing.
No, wait, let's answer your first question.
So we'll have Dr. May respond to
Let's do one question. We got plenty of time, so nobody has to worry. Yes, sir.
I have a question with the professor.
Well, can we?
Okay, let's have Donald May.
Let's do one question. Let's do one question at a time.
Yeah, go ahead. You answer, and I'll take this.
I'm presenting the quotes of the Founding Fathers because I'm a constitutional originalist. I believe that the Constitution, as originally intended, is the proper foundation for our country. And I believe that the foundations that were laid down by the Founding Fathers are enduring truths that have existed throughout and have worked throughout history. They worked in the Greek Republic, they worked in the Roman Republic, they worked in the evolution of Western civilization, they worked under British common law. And they were incorporated, and into our Constitution. Some of this was solidified by John Locke and other people, but these are the things that I believe are foundational. And no matter what has changed in the minds of men, that these foundational ideas have not changed, just like I believe the Ten Commandments haven't changed. So I believe the Ten Commandments are a very good thing to have in courthouses and to have in schools, so people can look and see these are our foundations, and that's why I put them down. Just like in a court of law, if I were to go to the Supreme Court and present a case, I would present things that support my argument. If I were a lawyer, as some of these young folks are or will be, if I were to go to court and present things that supported the opponent's point of view, the person I'm represented would probably sue me for malpractice.
Your follow-up?
Well, you make me think of Arnold Loewy's son-in-law, who says it's because it's in the Bible and that's it.
No, I'm just presenting an argument. We're here, this is a debate. So it's not this, and as I've said throughout, I've said that Dr. Loewy and I have parallel, and that the great thing about this country is debate. There is no fixed law. My background is science. Science is not fixed. My understanding of God is, I have foundational principles, but I do not understand the true nature of God. I'm not going to understand that for at least another 30 to 50 years when I go up there and get to meet the guy, and I'm hoping to have a long conversation with somebody up there so I can figure out what's going on, because I think it's pretty exciting. But again, I'm presenting my opinion. That's what a debate is all about. I'm not saying, if you don't believe what I say, you're wrong. I'm saying this is my perspective.
Originalism can only get you so far. I do not think, as I was mentioning in regard to Justice Brennan's opinion in the school prayer case, I do not think the framers thought about whether public schools, which were not compulsory then, should have prayers when the people were more religiously homogeneous then than they are now. So I just don't think that's a question they came to grips with. And to try to answer that question on originalism gets you to do an awful lot of phony stuff. In addition, you have the problem of what one commentator called law office history, namely the history that some law office can come up with. I mentioned that for all of the quotes that Don has, I can come up with counter quotes, which seem to say different things. And at least to the extent that you're relying on Story, he would marginalize Jews as well as Muslims and others in favor of Christianity. So in terms of if you go original, you have to figure out who your source is going to be. If you use Roger Williams, our most pious founder, you come up with the idea that he really wanted separation. He didn't want the wilderness of the state to have any part in the garden of the church. And I think originalism can only get you so far. And certainly if originalism would, one of the questions I suppose has to be is should the effect of the decision be relevant? That is, I know one of the major differences between Scalia and Breyer, I wrote about this, is that Scalia, at least in form, says that the impact of his decisions don't matter. We just go to what the original intent was, and if you don't like it, too bad. You can always amend the Constitution. Breyer thinks that there's a great many factors that a judge has to take into account. An impact on society is one of them. I think I agree with that. I think it's fine to have one justice or maybe two in the court who don't think impact on society matters. And by the way, I don't think Scalia means it anyway. Otherwise, he wouldn't have voted the way he did in Bush v. Gore. But in terms of impact on society, I think that does and probably should matter.
Professor, we have a question back
Yes.
here from you.
Yeah, I have a question for the professor, and maybe later one for Dr. May. This is sort of complicated, but would you not agree? This is sort of like a setup. Would you not agree, if not why, that when you use the word morality, suffuse your entire preservation, you use the word morality, suffused it. And it seemed to me that implicit in the way you use the word morality was a definition of it, that it flowed from one or another specific religious creed as codified by current or past religious leaders, the Bible, the creeds of the churches, and that you are not using morality, the word morality, to mean a code of belief or rights and wrongs held by the majority of the people. In other words, you use morality to be, you refer to the Ten Commandments as something moral, other stuff in Leviticus as moral. Dr. May even later referred to some sort of implicit notion that what's being done in the ACA was moral or not. But my question to you is, don't you agree that the way you use morality imply that morality flows from a specific creed drawn up by specific people at a specific time or place?
It can be individual, but in the first place, to be very clear, and I think I was clear on this, that first of all, of course, legislation should be moral, and morality can influence what people. My point was that morality without any utilitarian basis has to come from some kind of worldview. That is, I mean, for example, it may be thought to be moral to protect fetuses. Other people might think it is moral to protect choice of potential baby carriers. But whatever, you might think it's moral. But if you're going to make somebody a criminal for not living up to your morality, then you have to be able to point to something other than the fact that you think it's immoral. You have to point to some utilitarian basis for it.
Follow up. If you base morality on a religious creed, I don't know of a religious creed, even of my liberal, tolerant Presbyterian church, I don't know of a religious creed that says, it doesn't say, God is, we know what God said. We know what God said. We know what's right and wrong, and what we say is right and wrong. If we say something's right and something's wrong, and they disagree, they're wrong, we're right. All the religions say that. So if you base the concept of morality on a creed of any kind, then you're focusing in on the people who codified that creed and says, we're right and everybody else is wrong. And if you base morality on that, then you're basing it on religion, and in and of itself, the use of morality in that way is in and of itself an establishment clause. An establishment of religion.
That is correct if, and it's an important if there can be no basis for it in, I mean, certainly laws against murder are fine.
That's right.
But if you can't find any basis, and frankly, as I talked about in the article, there's some that are borderline, like honor thy father and mother. I think you're perfectly free to hate your father, but you might be required to support him if he's indigent and would otherwise become a welfare charge. There'd be a utilitarian reason for it, but not just a bit. It has to be something other than the biblical reason. That's the position I'm taking.
I have something to add really quick to that. So when you're talking about this utilitarian reason, these reasons, such as health reasons or scientific reasons, or the breakdown of the family is one of those things when we talk about the sexuality, people's personal sexual choices. Okay, so whether there are health reasons or scientific reasons behind something, now, should that be the basis? Or should the basis be personal liberty, personal freedom?
Well, obviously, although it is true that we have a constitution to protect us from government, we have a government to set rules and regulations, and the thing that judges work at doing is figuring out when the regulation has gone too far or gone in an inappropriate way.
So,
And it has
when you say
various
inappropriate,
constitutional,
what do you mean by that?
excuse me?
When you say inappropriate, what do you mean?
Well, constitutionally inappropriate, if it interferes with free speech, if it interferes with free exercise of religion, if it respects an establishment of religion, which frankly, I, unlike Justice Thomas, think is designed to protect free exercise of religion. If it interferes with our right to bear arms, if it causes us to be subject to unreasonable seizures, if it denies us procedural protections at trials, that kind of thing. I'm actually not in favor of making up new constitutional rights. I am in favor of giving a broad construction to the rights that we do have. But I'm not in favor of making up new rights, even if they're rights I'd like to have. To that extent, I agree with Justice Scalia, although, as I say, I don't think he was consistent with it in Bush v. Gore. I was consistent with it in Roe v. Wade, where I really do favor free abortion. I think that's good policy. But I don't think I have a constitutional right to have that policy enacted. This gentleman, I think,
Yeah,
had
a
a
short question.
We have one more question.
If I may,
Go ahead, let him go first.
I got a list. Where do we stand today in religion and politics?
What, could you be a little bit more specific with that? I mean,
want to be very general.
all right, well, politicians are free to be religious. Presidents, as they have done from Washington to Obama, are free to invoke the deity in their speeches.
I mean, in the context, as a country, are we losing religiously, or where do we stand there? That was.
Well, you said politics. I think if it's hard to say what direction we're moving in, because the judges, frankly, the question of which religious symbols are permitted to be put up by government is something which varies. If we would never say you could never put up a religious symbol. For example, in the Supreme Court, we have Moses and the Ten Commandments in the company of other lawgivers like Charlemagne and Justinian and various others, and that's perfectly fine. But in Kentucky, when we single out the Ten Commandments as being the one thing that you're supposed to venerate, that's not fine, because that's the government putting down its very powerful foot on behalf of one perspective. And that's why we have an issue there. Now, sometimes we allow it and sometimes we don't, and the cases are a little bit convoluted. The Ten Commandments are okay at the Texas State House. They were not okay in the Kentucky courthouses. Across in the desert is okay by a 5-4 vote for a Veterans War Memorial. And I could go through specific cases. I don't think we have time to do that.
I appreciate it, and it's a message that ought to go out. And
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that, sir.
What y'all have debated is a message that should go out, and I appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much.
I actually really like that question really quick before we.
Could I, wait.
I'd like Dr. May.
Let me comment on some of these questions, okay?
That's exactly what
You raise a good point, because the Ten Commandments was considered by our founding fathers and all preceding governments to be the foundation of the government. And this goes back to the time of the Roman Empire. The Romans went from being pagans to becoming Christians, and officially Christians. And if you think of that, the fact that Rome, the people try to vilify Rome from conquering all of Europe, and then from But what happened was that they spread Christianity and the Ten Commandments across all of Europe. So when the Muslims decided to come into Europe in the 700s, they came into Spain and Portugal, and then in 731 they came into Europe. Well, they were stopped if it hadn't been for the Christians, if it hadn't been for Charles Martel the Hammer and my ancestors at the Battle of Tours in 732, they would have gone across the whole of Europe. I want to touch on one other thing on morality, because I believe that every law that is passed is an attempt to institute specific morality. If you look at every law, it's an attempt to institute specific morality. We talked about health insurance. They're saying it's not moral for you to not have health insurance, because everybody needs to have health insurance, and then you need to buy health insurance so you can subsidize the people who don't.
But who said it's immoral?
Well, the government says that you have to have it, otherwise you're going to get punished.
But not because of morality, because of
But they're
utilitarian
instituted-
purposes.
no, but here's another thing, carbon dioxide. They're saying it's immoral to produce carbon dioxide, so you're going to have to cut down your amount of carbon dioxide. It's immoral to clear forest
No, they're
lands.
saying it's physically harmful to do those things. They're
But
not
again,
saying
that's
it's
morality. That's morality. That's morality. Same thing as wetlands. It's more. They're saying it's immoral to drain wetlands, but other people are saying, well, there's a opposing view there. Some people want wetlands so ducks can land there. Some people like me want to drain wetlands so the mosquitoes don't land there. I mean, again, it's imposing morality. Every one of these laws is saying this is a moral imperative that you have health insurance.
Don,
And
I
you can
don't
call
think
it- you
that's
can call it-
morality. I don't think that's morality. I think that's a policy question, not based on morality, but based on the question of whether, from a utilitarian perspective, it's better that people have health insurance or better that people don't have health.
Okay,
Whether it's better or not.
then let's take it one step further. You call it utilitarian, we go to the family structure. I think it's utilitarian for a government to be based on family structure. Now, you might say that's morality. I think the two coincide, but I think it's definitely utilitarian that we maintain the family structure, that we have men married to women, and that we have fathers in the home. That's utilitarian.
So you would rather base laws off of utilitarian reason rather than on liberty?
No, I think utilitarian and liberty come together, because what is liberty? Liberty is freedom based on personal responsibility, which is utilitarian.
According to the individual, right?
Personal responsibility, individual personal responsibility, coupled with the ability to fail. Let me repeat that. People confuse freedom and liberty. Liberty is freedom plus personal responsibility, the personal responsibility to maintain that freedom, plus the ability to fail in that effort if one does not apply oneself. That is the concept, the way I look at liberty. It has based on morality, it is based on utilitarian. Utilitarian and morality, I think, are parallel in many respects.
But if you're forcing somebody to not do something because you think that there's a utilitarian reason for it, then, but it goes against liberty, then how do you justify it?
You can't. You can't force somebody to buy health insurance.
But you can force somebody to not get married. You can say you're not allowed to get married.
I don't think you can.
But it's a breakdown of the family structure if you allow homosexuals.
I see what you're
to
saying.
get
I see what you're saying.
married,
And that is utilitarian, and that's utilitarian in society, and that is not limited to Jews or Christians. It goes across the whole gamut of people, including up until the past century. It was also among secular people.
So how does it support liberty? It's supporting a utilitarian reason, definitely, indefinitely. But how does it support liberty? Not allowing homosexuals to be married. How is that
Or put differently, if John's really in love with George, do you think we're better off if he marries Mary, who he doesn't really want to marry, but he will because he's not allowed to marry George, and then they form a family? Is that good for society?
Well, there's a difference, because nobody's ever permitted, here's the difference. People, the marriage concept of homosexuality has come in so they get the benefits that are associated with marriage, such as insurance, such as retirement, such as survival benefits. and they come to the employer and say, I am married, so you have to give my male spouse or my same-sex spouse these entities which are reserved for an opposite-sex spouse. Nobody has prevented ever the homosexual from entering into a contractual unit where they become the survivor, they become the beneficiary, or that they become, if the person becomes disabled, they have the power of attorney or the power of health care over that person. All of that is permissible. The only reason for establishing marriage, the provision of marriage, is to allow in our current society for the other partner, the same-sex partner, to receive benefits from the government or from the employer that which were not entitled to.
I'm not sure all those things are permissible in all states, including Texas.
They're not.
I mean, all the things you were talking about outside of marriage.
So we have one question back here from a little while ago.
Yes, this gentleman.
Yeah, all I have to say is oiga vote. But I want to apologize right off for my cell phone going off, and if I was my teenage kid, I would be able to turn it off. I tried.
Well, I was so engrossed in what Dr. May had to say that I didn't
It didn't bother me in the least.
It's been going off. My daughter's been texting me.
Well, hopefully everything's okay with your daughter.
Oh, she wants something from me.
Well, hopefully something good. Good, food is good.
Did you have a question?
But yes, I have a comment first about the Declaration of the Constitution. It wasn't such a good thing to declare that black people, that is slaves, were 3/5 of a human being. But that's not really what
they were the people who declared us a Christian nation.
No, but I want to comment on that because that's the reason that they were declared 3/5 was because population determined voting strength, okay? And the founding fathers did not want to end slavery when they wrote the Constitution. So they made some compromises in there. One, that laws could be written after 1808 to end slavery. Well, that didn't happen because the Democrats opposed that. They put in there that slaves would not be counted the same as other people. Even slaves couldn't vote. But basically they were counted as 3/5 so that the South would not have a greater number of representatives in Congress. This was to keep down the representation of the slave states for the purpose of getting rid of slavery. It had nothing to do with the fact that the people were less important. It was so that the states couldn't count their slaves to have a greater representation in the House of Representatives because the purpose was to get rid of slavery.
Well, it just shows you the mindset of the people at that time that it was okay to have slaves. But that's not the main thing I want to talk about.
Let me bring up one other thing. There was no place in the world that said the first concept that slavery was not appropriate and should be abolished came with our founding fathers, went over to Wilberforce in England, and this was the first time in history that anybody said it's not appropriate to own human beings. Because we are establishing a country where the people are in charge. And it's not appropriate that that man owns another man. No other time in history, including you look at the Old and New Testament, and there's nothing in the Old or New Testament that says it's not appropriate to own another human being.
They actually did own slaves.
Yeah, they actually did own slaves. And Christ spoke many times about slaves. But our founding fathers, who you keep trying to vilify, were the first people in the history of the world to say it's not right to own other people. And when we started, finally we got to our Civil War, and we look at the number of slaves in the world, we had 5% of the slaves in the world. We are the only country in the history of the world ever to fight war to free slaves. The first was the Barbary Coast Wars, because they were taking slaves over there, including our people. The second was our Civil War. No other country ever waged a war for the purpose of ending slavery.
There are like business factors
Can I finish?
Sure, yeah, I'm sorry, interrupt. Yeah, absolutely.
Since you interjected another point about slavery in America, and America being the first, I'm not a historian, so I don't know. I thought England had outlawed slavery.
They did. They did in the 1820. No,
Is that not right?
What they did was they Wilberforce and those people outlawed slavery, the transportation of slavery, because it was British slavers that were transporting slaves. You're absolutely correct. And you're raising great questions.
You used an adjective, vilify. No, I guess that's not an adjective, that's a verb. What I'm talking about is truth, fact.
Yeah.
And I'm not an expert on either one of those.
No, I didn't mean that badly. I didn't mean that badly. I apologize.
Let me finish.
I apologize.
I'm not pointing fingers, I'm looking for the truth. Now, the main thing that I wanted to mention was I need a question answered. I'm 76 years old, so I was born in 1937. Both of my parents are Jewish, Ashkenazi Jews. And the country that I grew up in as a kid, up until I guess I was in my mid-20s, did not proffer the term Judeo-Christianity. And by the way, there are more than 10 commandments. There are 632 commandments in the Bible. And I didn't experience Judeo-Christianity. What I experienced was not a severe prejudice like the blacks, because I look white and I don't look particularly Jewish. So I can hide out. But what I heard in the background, well, when I went to Hebrew school, kids on the way, I don't know how they knew I was Jewish, but they threw rocks at me. And they taunted me with things like, if your name is Davy, join the Jewish Navy and we'll all go free. That doesn't sound like a joining of the Jews and the Christians. And I'm not saying this to demean Christians. I'm just stating what history was. I went with some people gave me a ride to my uncle's house in the country, upstate New York. And as we drove into the driveway, they saw my uncle's last name on a sign. And one of the guys said, Bernstein, who the hell is Bernstein? Because these guys didn't know me, they didn't know I was Jewish. So that was the truth about their feeling about Jews. These people came from a small community where I lived in New York City, so it wasn't quite that bad. But my friends used to say to me, not say to me, but talk among each other, and with me present, demeaning Jews, and then they'd say, oh, but not you, Ed, you're different. Now, had I been bright enough at the time, I would have said, oh, you mean my uncles, my aunts, my cousins, my mother and my father, but not me. So I want to know, historically, do you remember seeing a movie called Gentleman's Agreement with Gregory Peck? You ought to see that sometime, because that's the truth about America during the 30s, 40s, and I don't know. I want to know when this all changed, when all of a sudden the Jews became wedded to the Christians in Judeo-Christianity. When Christianity first started, it was a sect of the Jews. It was the Jews who were Christians. But then the Jews became resistant to joining that particular sect. So the Christians went outside of Judaism and looked for pagans. And that was when there was a split. And that's when the Christians decided that the Jews weren't so good. And it continued through pogroms. My father came from Russia, and he saw pogroms. He saw people, he told me, he saw people lying in the street dead because they were Jews. I want to know when this tide turned. I was a school teacher here for 29 years. Actually, 11 years in Hudson, Mexico, and the rest here. And every meeting that I had to go to as a teacher with the faculty, somebody had to get up and say a prayer and end it with, and we pray this in our, how does it go? We pray this in Christ's name. And damn it, I never got up and said, no, we don't. Because I don't. Because I'm a Jew, and I don't believe in Jesus Christ. This is not a Christian nation. This is a nation of the majority of the people who are Christians, and I feel like Dr. Loewy, I feel like I'm going to be tolerated, and I don't mean tolerated in a good sense, I mean, okay, you're a Jew, you're not as bad as those Muslims. And what happened with the Muslims when they tried to establish that, what the heck was it? There wasn't even a mosque. It was a cultural center in which they were going to have a room for Jews and a room for Christians and a room for Islamic people. No, but that wasn't good enough. I mean, they weren't allowed to do that. They were vilified. Now, I'm going to use that word. They were vilified. This is a country of the majority of the people who are Christians, and for the most part, I'm going to say it, they're intolerant of other religions. They talk a good game, but then they say things like, this is a Christian nation. And it's not a Christian nation. If you make it into a Christian nation, you're leaving me out.
Wait a second. I want to answer this because he raises good questions. No, we haven't gotten to the point where we're intolerant. Right now, we have Christians being killed in the Middle East, and nobody's stepping in. We have. Wait. Let me answer.
That's not
No, wait. No, Jay. Just, will you give me a minute? You talk for 10 minutes. We didn't interrupt you. Please, just let me talk.
All right.
Okay, just let me talk. It hasn't changed. We've had Armenians killed in Turkey. We've had people killed all over the world. We have intolerance. We were based on Judeo-Christian principles. George Washington put the Star of David on the Great Seal of the United States. Okay? That's our foundation. That Great Seal, I just showed you that Great Seal, the Star of David, is up there. And our Revolutionary War was funded by Hyman Solomon. Put $25 billion of money in at that time, which would be worth $500 million now. Hyman Solomon put all his money in and refused to take any money back because he said, I've saved the country, I've saved a place. People are intolerant, people are mean. You've experienced things. You've experienced Jews being killed in Russia, Jews being killed in Germany. My family was involved and my friends were involved. One of my closest friends, he and his brother were down in Austria and transporting. They ran a lumber mill. In the daytime they brought logs down. At night they took Jews up into Switzerland. And then when the Nazi columns started coming in, they took themselves up and got off and went up there. There is intolerance. My family were German-speaking immigrants to this country from the 1820s to 1880s. During World War I, windows were broken in our property. My grandfather's car was painted yellow. One of the hired men were hung because they were German. Okay? My wife, World War II, her father and his family were locked up for 4 years because they were Japanese. Okay, that is not because of anything foundational in the United States government. That is because of individual people. We have people killed in Lubbock here every week, not because the government is bad, but because individual people tend to do something. FDR's friends in California coveted the fact that Japanese people were hardworking, had established farms, had established things. They bought the property for 2-3 cents on the dollar when those people were locked up. Her dad was locked up for 4 years. First thing he tried to do was enlist in the U.S. military. They knew that he was an activist. They declared him 4F. They said he had back problems. They kept him out of the military. I went out when he was 93 years old. He and I were out digging trenches, and he could still outdig me. He had no back problems. He helped put together the 442nd, the most decorated unit in U.S. history, the go for broke. Half of those guys died because they were protecting a country that they believed in. Now, they were attacked by a few people. People attacked Jews. That didn't mean all the Germans were bad. Okay? The Middle East attacks Christians. That doesn't mean all the Muslims are bad. It's individual people who are evil. This country was put together on liberty and freedom. And yes, we've done bad things. Yes, we had slavery. But people have risen up and they stopped slavery. We had 5% of the slaves in the world. Was slavery bad? Yes. But you look at how many blacks are in right now in South America, you look at how many blacks are in Brazil and how many blacks are in the United States and the prosperity of those. For every black that was imported in the United States as a slave, 20 were imported to Brazil. They worked people to death. After the Civil War, most of the black people who were on the plantations stayed on the plantations as sharecroppers and as partners with the people because they felt that they were taken good care of before then. I'm not justifying slavery. But I understand prejudice, sir. My family went through it. We had to stop speaking German. Her family stopped speaking Japanese. If you want to look at the history, go to the History Channel, go to Walter Cronkite's expose on the internment camps, go to the Discovery Channel, go to Snow Falling on Cedars. The person speaking at every one of those, the prominent person speaking there is my father-in-law. He was the guy who did all of those shows, and he spent his life trying to stamp out injustice. And he never believed that injustice took place because the foundations of this country were wrong and the founding fathers were wrong. He blamed it on individual people.
His question was, since when can you appropriate
the syllables Judeo in the phrase Judeo-Christian? He gave these examples of discrimination against the Jews as an example of why the Jews felt bad about the use of the term Judeo-Christian. The Christian religion is one, and the Jews assert to themselves to this day that they are a separate religion from the Christian religion, and he was objecting to the fact that the religious fundamentalists are using the term Judeo to baptize their authoritarian theocracy ideas with the Jewish religion as well as the fundamentalist Christian.
Not trying to do anything.
So that's something that's freedom of speech.
Where do you get the right to do that?
I don't need a right. I don't need the right to acknowledge the Jewish foundations of the Christian religion. We got the Old Testament. I don't need anybody to tell me I can call myself say I have Judeo-Christian foundations.
The question was, when did this change?
I don't know that anything's ever changed.
What?
I don't know that anything's ever changed. We have the Star of David on the Great Seal of the United States of America.
Let me comment on this a little bit. I think it's been more evolutionary than revolutionary in terms of the frequency with which it's used. I really do not believe we are a Christian nation the distinctions I draw are like saying Iran is a Muslim nation, Turkey is a nation of which a majority of their citizens are Muslim. We are more like the Christian equivalent of Turkey than the Christian equivalent of Iran. In that sense, we are not. In terms of timing, it's certainly been more in recent years that I've heard the term Judeo-Christian used. Candidly, and I guess I should count this as among the things of good fortune, I have virtually never felt discriminated against by virtue of my Judaism. Probably and rarely have heard a negative. Probably the closest I ever came was a couple times when I dated a Catholic Italian girl in Boston, and one time her family, who didn't know me, when we were talking about restaurants, we mentioned a local deli. They said, well, it's owned by a couple of cheap Jews. That's the closest thing I ever heard to anything that was anti-Semitic. And in fact, when I came here for my interview, as it turned out, I didn't realize it at the time, but it coincided with Yom Kippur. And I thought for a minute, well, should I ask if there's a synagogue here and see if I can arrange to go to it that night? But, well, if I do that, that will type me as Jewish, and this was a fairly significant chair I was applying for. Is this going to be a negative factor? And I said, well, if it is, then I don't want to come here. In fact, they did get me a synagogue. One of my future colleagues was a member and actually officer in the synagogue who drove me there. I have never heard the slightest negative concept of this or in any way be treated less favorably by virtue of my religion. Well, I don't know how long I'm going to live. I say I'm going to live to 106, and if I do, this statement may be true. I think in my lifetime I will see a Jewish president. If I live to 106, if I don't, maybe
Probably
not.
before that.
You know Lauren Bacall, I saw her interviewed on Turner Classic Movies one evening, and she said when she first went to Hollywood, she was totally reluctant to say that she was Jewish, because she was afraid that she would not be hired.
May I ask a question, and it relates, and it really sort of gets to the heart of why I wanted to organize this, and that is, Dr. May, if sort of the party line of the Republican Party is that we're a Christian nation, and I've heard that from a lot of the politicians, isn't that sort of exclusive, and wouldn't it be useful from a sort of a politically pragmatic aspect to be able to, if we want to say, discourage abortion or gay marriage, wouldn't it be more politically persuasive to sort of have a utilitarian basis to dovetail? I mean, it would be, it's one thing to have a religious argument from morality, but then another to supplement it, sort of a utilitarian, as Professor Loewy said, and be able to be more inclusive and less exclusive as a party in national politics.
Well, like our own country, the founding fathers considered us a Christian nation, as did the Supreme Court, as did the House of Representatives and the Senate, all the way up until we got up into 1947. They considered us a Christian nation, and because of those Christian values, and because of the way the founding fathers put our country together, we were open to all people. Muslims were not reviled. Individuals didn't like certain people. I mean, as the gentleman mentioned, in Hollywood, it was very anti-Christian. It was very pro-communist. It was very pro-secular. And in Europe, we're getting back again to anti-Jewish sentiment in Europe. I mean, it's significant. It's being open to Muslims, but the Jews are being discriminated against. You think of what happened in Europe, or you look at the Jewish Foundation. Look at one thing to do. Go look at who got Nobel Prizes. Half of the Nobel Prizes in the world have been given to Jewish people. And if that doesn't tell you something about the ability of these people, and we look at what happened to Europe, Germany was the most intellectual, advanced society on the planet at the time. Why was that? It's because of the Jews. I mean, they were the foundation, they were the culture, they were the music, they were the intellectuals, they were the scientists. People like Einstein and Rickover and all these guys came over escaped and came here. And
can I just interject?
Well, just let me just finish my comment. And what happened was we lost the culture of Europe, and now it's being replaced by a bunch of people who are uneducated and want to impose their culture. The Jews lived in harmony.
The question is about modern Republican politics.
I think his point was that using the term Christian nation does exclude him and me.
Well, I'm saying,
and you want us to be part of it,
right?
And that's not consistent with the term Christian nation.
Well,
now Judeo-Christian nation does make us a part of it. I feel a part of it then, but I don't think it's a good thing, because I don't think there should be insiders and outsiders.
What about just the nothing? People that don't even identify as atheists or agnostic.
I'm a Jew, and when I hear this word Judeo-Christian, I feel that we have sort of been bushwhacked, that you want to tack the name Judeo onto Judeo-Christian for justifying.
Well, I have heard a friend of mine, one of my colleagues at Connecticut, my first law school, is from Mississippi. He talked about how once Governor Ross Barnett came to his synagogue and trying to be as complimentary as he possibly could, and as uplifting as he possibly could and inclusive as he possibly could, referred to the assembled as my fellow Christians. Needless to say, that didn't go over too well, and I doubt that he got himself a lot of votes from that meeting.
This debate was to be on whether or not religion should play a role in public policy. If there is any argument in favor of saying no, it should not, it's what's been going on in the last 15 or 20 minutes. Here we are arguing about various religions and the term Judeo-Christian that has been used within recent years in order to somehow solidify the virtue of having a religious background to public policy. And by God, if there's any reason why we should do away with religious influence in public policy, has been brought up by all of the arguments that just suddenly flooded out of us in this room today. There should, I would point out to you, you've spoken about England. England has a state church. The Queen is the head of the state church. But you go to England and bring up religion in politics, you would be laughed at. No politicians over there mention their religion. The public are disinterested in the role that religion plays.
That's not true, because I've worked in England. We spent a lot of time there.
I'm from England. I know that it's true.
Well, you may dissociate with different people than I do over there.
I'm associated with the public. Anyway,
consider it not to be a religious influence, but an influence of exceptionalism.
Of what?
Exceptionalism.
Exceptionalism.
What do you mean?
Exceptionalism is a choice. Morality is, and I would suggest Dr.
You don't find British politicians professing their religion.
Rather than arguing morality from...
I've got to go, I'm late.
Have a great day.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks for your input.
But Dr. May, from the perspective of exceptionalism is a choice. And I think you may have a whole lot more success arguing morality if you interject the term or exchange for morality the term exceptionalism, of which morality is only a portion of the exceptionalism that was established by our founding fathers.
Absolutely.
You know, when we start bringing in all these, and I've got nothing against immigrants, but they're coming to the United States. That does not mean they came here for a reason. That does not mean that they have a right to change the United States, change the foundations that were set by our founding fathers in order to chip away and erode that foundation that this founding fathers established.
But you bring up a good point, because originally people came here. My ancestors came here to get away from the King of Bavaria, because his soldiers came in and took their money, their sheep, their goats, and even a couple of the daughters, okay, and carried them off. And they came here so they could work in freedom. And my great-grandfather, whose grandfather was the guy who came here in the 1820s, said he came here so he could work in peace and the government wouldn't come in. And you bring up a good point of exceptionalism, and what group of people throughout history have typified exceptionalism more than any other? It's the Jewish people. And that's why they've been so hated throughout history, is because they have a moral ethic, they have a work ethic, they mind their own business, they value liberty, they get up in the morning, they work hard, they go to, till sundown, and they have their houses in good order, the houses are clean, everything looks good, their shops are clean, and they become wealthy because they're willing to work harder and provide exceptional product. And that's why they're hated.
That's a description of the Jewish people?
Yes.
Well, it's just a part of it. I mean, it's one aspect.
They come from Jewish people.
Well, they're exceptional. It's the most exceptional culture.
Jewish people vary like everybody else.
Yeah. But they're hated because they always became the most successful in the countries in which they're in.
You know why? Because they had to fight like the Dickens to overcome the prejudice of the Christians.
Well, the prejudice came in because they were successful. They were hated again. The coveting.
Do you know what the population of the Jews was in Germany in 1933?
It was several,
Percentage-wise?
it was significant.
Yeah, it was less than 1%. It was 0.75%.
Getting
I
back
don't
to-
understand your point there, but I mean, I'll accept that. I don't understand.
Getting back to the policy
Yeah,
thing, before we end, I just have a question. So what Ryan was saying over here is that we have these policies that are established, and what a lot of the politicians and a lot of our representatives have said is that it's based off of Christian morality. And even if it's not just Christian morality, some sort of religion, that it's a morality from religion.
Yeah.
Now, if you're going to start supporting legislation against somebody's liberty, okay? And you're going to be using this utilitarian reasoning behind supporting that. The reasons why you're supporting, say, let's go back to the homosexuality thing, okay? You're supporting that we do not establish that, and then the reasons are because of the governmental benefits that we give. So why wouldn't we go ahead and come back and say, let's let everybody have their benefits all across the board? Should we even be taking income away from certain people and benefiting only certain people? It doesn't make sense to me. So are you going to be using what
I'm confused. I'm real confused.
I think I understand what she's saying. I think what she's saying is that to the extent that you could take your positions apart from religiosity rather than as based on religiosity, you would be persuasive to a larger number of people. You would not lose the religious people, but you would pick up some of the others, and there are a significant minority who are not Jewish or Christian, or even Muslim, whose vote is relevant to you. You and your party do not want to throw away the atheist vote, the agnostic vote, whatever. At least I don't think you do.
No, and that's inclusive, because again, our country as a Christian nation has been inclusive of all of these people. My in-laws are all Buddhist, okay? I get along with them fine. Some of my best friends. I'm sorry, sir. That this is, you're welcome. Make your comments. I'm sorry. But in any case, that's my basis, and it doesn't bother me that people disagree with me or laugh about me because I'm secure in my beliefs.
I guess what I would say is I can't put my support behind anybody that is going to be voting for something that goes against liberty, personal liberty, and
the foundation of liberty is Western civilization. And the foundation of values in Western civilization is Judeo-Christian law
and nobody
culture.
can take that away. However, we can base our laws off of liberty and not base it off of even utilitarian reasons.
Utilitarian.
Yeah, regardless of whether it's a better practice to only marry between a man and a woman only, not a man and several women or a woman and several men, that goes against liberty, regardless of what the reasons are. It doesn't matter if it is a moral reason or religious reason or a utilitarian reason. It shouldn't matter. It goes against liberty.
Well, then you could expand liberty. Does liberty include the right to kill off the disabled or the elderly?
I wish I would have brought this up earlier, but this is an example of religion entering into policy. This is a bill that was passed by the Texas Senate unanimously, and in the House of Representatives in Texas, in Austin, with only 2 dissenting votes. This applies to public schools. A school district may educate students about the history of traditional winter celebrations and allow students and district staff to offer traditional greetings regarding the celebrations, including Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and Happy Holidays. So it's okay if you're Jewish, it's okay if you're Christian, and I don't know, if you're an atheist, all of a sudden you're subjected to all this stuff. And there are no guidelines here. No guidelines as to how the school district is going to implement this. So are there going to be classes held? Are there going to be, yeah, they did, okay, signs and symbols. So a creche will be okay, and a menorah will be okay. Suppose you don't like any of those things. Suppose you're an atheist.
You
Oh,
don't
and
have
by
to-
the way, this year, Hanukkah, or you might pronounce it Chanukah, comes on Thanksgiving. It's not a winter holiday.
Last question,
Sorry.
answer for me, if you want.
I guess my response to that would be that the teaching, I think, is fine. One of the things the court's been real clear about is teaching religion and teaching about religion is not constitutionally problematic. As for greetings, of course anybody can greet anybody any way they want to. Those were illustrative and kind of unnecessary. As for putting the religious symbols in the school, I guess to see what they looked like, I have less of a problem with it than to keep it there in a special place. I think it probably would have been better if they just went with pictures on that rather than actually having the item. Although certainly it could be educational, and that's what you'd need to look at
But we know what
how it was
people are
being
like.
used.
We know what people are like, and we know that some people will take advantage.
The problem
The
is that
reality of
the public
human
schools are
behavior
not private
is-
schools.
We can't legislate against that. That's their freedom. That's their liberty.
By the way, liberty and freedom are all relative. If you want total freedom and liberty, go live by yourself somewhere. If you're a human being, you will have to be immersed among other human beings, and you will give up liberty.
We use the term ordered liberty here.
I'm sorry, what?
With ordered liberty, which I think is basically Don's definition of liberty. And the ordered is what changes it from pure freedom.
Right.
Okay, we dismissed?
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Great question.